covering the aftermath of the Harris campaign. So, Garrett, let's start with you. What can you tell us about these latest rounds of appointments, and what do they tell us about Trump's agenda?
Well, the Keith Kellogg pick is the most interesting one to me because it says Trump is serious about his plans to try to end the Ukraine war and end it fast. Kellogg is the author of a research paper on exactly how you could do that in an America First framework. He wants to see concessions from Ukraine and essentially, tell the Russians, we're going to arm Ukraine to the teeth until you guys get out of there. But basically after the fact, that this is a stalemate and it's got to end. So I'm watching that. The health picks are interesting to me, but mostly it's kind of an elections have consequences set of selections here where you've got a bunch of COVID contrarians to a certain extent who have ridden the wave of blowback to the COVID lockdowns into these positions in the federal government. Folks who are anti-masking, anti-vaccine mandates. That's now par for the course among conservatives. And so, I think there could be some shock in the medical establishment and among some elected Democrats when their confirmation hearings come up. I don't expect them to have any problems with the Republican-controlled Senate.
Yeah, and let's talk about one of them, Jay Bhattacharya. He's going to lead the NIH. He was a big advocate of herd immunity, which there is still quite a bit of controversy around in the medical community. Isn't it important to remember that Donald Trump was the president during a large part of these decisions that were made on lockdowns, on mask mandates, on the installation of the vaccine and the requirements around the vaccine? How is he taking an about face on this, and what does this appointment tell us about that?
Well, I think Donald Trump rode popular opinion within the Republican Party to a different place than where he started. And he's tried to have it both ways, especially early on in the primary season. You'll remember he tried to run on the idea that he was the father of the vaccine, but then sort of tried to have it that he was also opposed to vaccine mandates. He looked at what happened down in Florida, where Ron DeSantis rode his own opposition to COVID mandates into being a national figure who, at least for a moment, thought he had a chance of becoming the Republican presidential nominee. So Trump has embraced the kind of contrarian views on COVID now. Bhattacharya, as you pointed out, kind of became famous for his opposition on COVID. But he's also a serious academic, and he works on issues like, how do you link, physician performance with pay for hospitals and doctors? How do you deal with an aging population and keeping them healthy? So I think there's a broader set of issues here at play, but there are certainly these kind of anti-COVID orthodoxy celebrities on the right who are now going to get their moment in the sun.
And we played some of Tom Homan and this kind of very tough talk that he's making about how they're going to plan to implement this mass deportation policy. Is this bluster, or are they going to make good on this promise?
Not from Homan. I mean, he's pretty serious about this. Look, I think there's a limit to what Trump can do, especially early. I mean, they could change the posture at ICE and at CBP, and I think they can give local law enforcement a sort of a morale boost if they want to kind of dig in on immigration matters. But there's only so much they can do without more money. Ultimately, they're going to need more money for detention facilities and planes and agents to get up to the scale and size they want on deportations. But Homan's tough talk also has a sort of an actual policy reason behind it. They are hoping, and he is hoping, that we see self-deportations start to happen even now from folks who don't want to screw around with potentially getting kicked out of the country and facing a 20-year ban. They go home now. They lower that risk to themselves. Homan wants to be bad cop, if you will, on that issue and see what they can get done again before Trump even takes office.
Okay. All right, Garrett, thank you. We appreciate it. Let's go to Nantucket now, Mike, and let's talk about kind of the fallout of the Harris campaign and this podcast heard around the world. The top campaign brass talked to Pod Save America about the campaign, and they largely deflected blame for the loss. I mean, how would you characterize the tone of what we heard from them?
Well, I think the two main takeaways, there was a lot of discussion about various specific and general trends that we saw over the course of the campaign. But every response that we basically got back from the senior leadership of the Harris campaign was that the national political environment stunk, to use a slightly more TV-friendly term than what was said on the show. And secondly, that they just didn't have enough time to get the vice president introduced to voters in the way that you would typically try to do for a major party nomination. I think the longest period of conversation on this podcast was about something that a lot of people have attributed to the vice president's failing, not just in those battleground states, but especially the even steeper drop-off we saw across the country. And that was the lack of a response to the ads we saw from the Trump campaign, in which the vice president, in her own words, talks about taxpayers paying for surgery for people transitioning, especially people in prisons. And so that was something that the campaign said that they tested relentlessly how to respond, whether to respond, and ultimately they decided that there was no gain in any of the measures that they tried to find to respond to it aggressively. They said, again, with more time, perhaps that this was something that would not have worked. The other thing that I found really interesting was that they essentially, in talking about the national political environment being so sour, and some of that is pointed in the direction of President Biden and just having very low approval ratings, was that the fact that she came so close in these battleground states, but then saw a significant drop-off in states like New Jersey, Illinois, California, is in some ways proves their point that in the places where they could intensely focus all their energy and resources, they were able to get close to a draw at least, whereas the more broader electorate that wasn't seeing their messaging, that wasn't seeing the vice president or Tim Walz or any of the other campaign surrogates, was more reflecting just the general national mood. So what does that mean for the party going forward? I thought one of the other more interesting points that was made by Jen O'Malley Dillon, the campaign chairman, was that they shouldn't necessarily overread the results of the election because, as she put it, Donald Trump is a very unique phenomenon in the Republican Party, and a lot of things that worked well for him wouldn't necessarily translate to other Republicans. So there are things that she says the party has been doing, especially as it relates to intense organizing, the field and money that they put into organizing across the battleground states, that needs to continue. And also, interestingly, outreach to Republicans and outreach to moderate voters. She said that's going to be essential for the party in especially Senate races that will be coming up, that we'll be talking about before we know it in 2026.
And Mike, thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. Happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy your trip to Nantucket. Joining me now for some more insight is former Alabama Democratic Senator Doug Jones and former North Carolina Republican Governor Pat McCrory. Thank you guys both for being here on the day before a holiday. I really appreciate it. Doug, I want to start with you and about that conversation related to Harris breaking with Biden. What did you think of that answer from Stephanie Cutter? Is that criticism valid, or is this just Monday morning quarterbacking at this point?
You know, look, I think it's a little bit of both. I think one of the things that folks should have planned on, I mean, breaking with Biden was going to be the obvious question. And I understand the reluctance to break, and I certainly understand the loyalty to the president, and she was there. But I think that could have been a little bit better honed. It should have been the first question: why are you running for president, and what would you do differently? Should have been the things that in the first 24 hours they honed in pretty quickly. And I don't think that they did that appropriately. And I also think that she could have probably deflected a little bit, and with the right preparation, I think she could have talked about the fact that in hindsight it's easy to look, but the fact is there were a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things that they could have done. In hindsight, sure, they could have done things different. On the border, for instance, why depend on that damn Congress to do something when you could do it on your own? They gave Congress too much credit. So there's a lot of things, I think, partly Monday morning quarterback, a lot of things that people are looking at, pointing fingers.
So, Pat, Democrats are going to pick up some seats in the House after all this is said and done. They held on to some seats in the Senate that you wouldn't think they would have held on to given the results of the presidential election. Trump is going to end up shy of the 50% margin nationally on the popular vote. It's going to end up being less than a 2 percentage point win for him in that regard. Should he and other Republicans be using the word mandate? Should that be the kind of their governing principle going into this Congress, or should they be looking for areas of compromise?
It's already too late. It's been branded as a landslide long earlier, and that brand is going to stick. They exceeded their expectations. As you know, a lot of times in politics, the senator knows this, that when you exceed the expectations, the victory is exaggerated, and he's going to take advantage of that. One thing that we haven't talked about in the past is I think the president, Trump, owes Greg Abbott a lot of credit for this. When he made the very tough and controversial policy to move some of the illegal immigrants up to the northern urban centers, democratically controlled, I think that had a huge impact on public opinion on illegal immigration, made that even more of a national issue. And I think that was huge. And Kennedy was a much bigger factor than I think the media gives them credit for. And I think Trump understands that by appointing him DHS secretary. And I think that was partly due to some of the COVID things that happened. For example, North Carolina during COVID, we closed down the bars, but didn't close down the breweries and said that was science. It made no sense. It was lobbying in our state capitals on, certain rules we had for big department stores, but not for small department stores, for churches and schools, but not for basketball games or protests. And I think there was hangover from COVID. And the last thing is the assassination attempt, I think had a much bigger factor on the selection than people realize. When he stood up after being shot and yelled, "Fight, fight, fight," I don't care who the Democrats made their nominee. It's tough to go against that. We've never seen anything like that in U.S. history. And I think we kind of moved on from the assassination attempt, not realizing the long-term impact of that.
All right, let's go back to your first point about immigration and now the implementation of these promises that the new now president-elect made during the campaign. And I want to start with you on this, Doug. He has this plan for mass deportations across the country. We've seen some Democratic executives in cities and states saying they're going to push back if the administration crosses the line or requires local law enforcement to help them. And this could turn into a standoff between municipalities and the federal government. How do you think this ends?
Look, I think we're a long way from trying to figure out how it ends. I think this is going to start slower than Tom Homan thinks it's going to start. They're talking about national security interests. They're talking about the most dangerous criminals. You're not talking about 11 million people. You're talking about a handful of people. What I think is going to happen is that the Trump administration is going to come in. They're going to do a lot of things for show right now, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They're going to do things to show that they are deporting people. But then they're going to run into the reality, I think, has been said on this show, of money and resources and how you logistically go about doing that. And that will trail off. I don't know if the mass deportations will ever get to the 11 million people. I think what is important to remember is exactly what we heard just a few moments ago. And that is they're banking on scaring the hell out of people to have them deport themselves and hopefully be able to get back into this country later. We'll see some things, but it's not going to be the mass deportation that everybody has been promised, at least initially.
So, Pat, I want you to try and separate yourself from the policy and more talk about this from your perch as a former governor and a former mayor. How would you have taken it if a czar of any kind came and said to you as a mayor, this is what we're going to do, you either get on board or get out of the way?
Well, the thing is, as a mayor and a governor, I swore to uphold the Constitution of not only my state, but also of the federal government. That was part of my oath in office. So there are certain federal laws on the book that I assumed as governor I would have to go along with and help. And in fact, in North Carolina, they just passed a state law in making the sheriffs cooperate with federal officials in some of the enforcement of illegal immigration. So there are going to be some turf battles, as there always been, between the state, local, and federal governments, because there's a fine line. There are gray areas in constitutional authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, Doug, I want to put up something that our friend Chuck Todd wrote in his new column. It reads, we as a nation have taken this concept of the ends justify the means and essentially turned the country's North Star of whatever it takes for our own success, not just whatever it takes for our own survival. The more we succumb to the idea that politics is such a brutal game that only the amoral or immoral need apply, we will cede our higher ground and won't like the reactionary world that develops around us. He's arguing that the norms of character in politics have taken a backseat to just zero-sum politics, whatever it takes to win. Do you agree with that? And are you concerned about the direction politics is taking in this country?
Oh, absolutely. I've been saying something similar for a long, long time. Character doesn't matter anymore. There used to be everything used to be character counts, and it doesn't really seem to count anymore. It's all about the politics. It's all about an agenda. And that's not for everybody. But I think the internet has hurt in that. I think the media has fostered that to some extent. And quite frankly, a winner take all. We have moved in this country in politics from just partisanship, to a culture of contempt, to a culture of hate. Us versus them, good versus evil. And I think that's kind of toxic for the country. Hopefully we can move past that. But I agree with Chuck. We've got to start having our politicians, like Governor McCrory. He was a good example, somebody that folks could disagree with, but look up to as a public servant. There are few public servants today and more politicians, and we need to get back to public service.
Well, Doug and Pat, it's nice to have a Republican and a Democrat on the show and have a very cordial and nice conversation, even if you might not agree on everything.